Okay, perhaps we can get started. My name is Richard Schmid. I am a faculty member here at Concordia in the Department of Education, Programs of Education and Technology. I got involved with this group a couple of years ago as chair of the department, and it's been my pleasure to continue working with QUESCREN. And this conference has been an eye-opener for me. I'm not an expert in this field, but I've learned a great deal. And so today we will share more ideas. The panel is wonderfully designed because we have just two people. They promised me that their comments are going to be quite short. We'll see how that works out. But the approach that we want to use is to promote as much discussion as possible. So we look forward to your questions and comments throughout the session. So our first speaker is Geoffrey Chambers. Geoffrey is interested in the cultural, geographical, historical, political, and institutional character of Quebec's English-speaking community. He has been involved in the Council of Quebec Minorities, Alliance Quebec as a founding role, with Montreal Children's Hospital, and Vice President Anglophone of the Liberal Party of Quebec. He is currently president of the Quebec Community Groups Network. So it's my pleasure to introduce Geoffrey.
Well, I wanted to make two observations to start. One is looking at the audience in this room, I think any number of you can get here giving the talk. So a very high quality of knowledge in this area amongst all of us. And so it's going to be much more fun to have a conversation than just to have a one-way expression of somebody's opinions. I've got a few things to just set out that I think might help the conversation. And I want to start with where Kate left off. I think that was a very interesting set of observations that she made this morning. But I think that there are some avenues of discussion she didn't go down, probably so she could get everything that she wanted to in her core thesis out, but that I'm tempted to go down. The English-speaking community in Quebec is not numerically in decline. There are places in which it's at risk. There are service profiles in regard to its circumstances that are very much more challenging than they used to be. There are lots of qualities of its circumstances that are difficult, but not numerically in decline anywhere in the province. But rights holders in the education system are defined, as we all know, very narrowly. And consequently, the numbers of people who have access to our schools is pinching, and there's a real issue there now. Kate pointed out that there are some very obvious solutions and kind of measures that could address these questions. Maybe not solutions that have been on the table for these 20 years past. But I'd like to put that into context. The regime that limits access to English schools is by its nature temporary. In the Canadian constitutional context, probably pretty robustly protected, but not, and nevertheless temporary. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26.3 says parents have an a priori right to choose the educational path of their children. I.e., the right to decide amongst the schools that are available which one you want to send your kid to does not lie with the government. It lies with the parent. So in Quebec, there is an abridgment of that right, a specifically agreed and constitutionally entrenched and litigated to within an inch of its life device, but it is in place to protect the French language during a period, a transitional period, in which it might be seen to be at risk. And I don't think any of us would argue that there was not a regime in place in the first half of the last century, or well into the second half, that created an educational practice that was deleterious to the interests of the majority community. So sending all immigrants to Protestant schools, which were English schools, as a matter of political principle, ended up being viewed as a terrible error. And I think we might agree that it was a terrible error. It was an abridgment of this same right, although that right hadn't yet been codified. that perhaps have to be compensated for, and there'll be a period after which this is no longer an acceptable compromise of civil rights. So we're not in that period yet. We've got to get there. We've got to find a way of keeping schools healthy and effective devices for their primary function, which is to provide education to our kids, and their secondary function, which is to be a center for community cohesion. And our school systems today, and our schools in our school systems today, managed through our school boards, perform that function. Not to the degree, not to the extent that we might in our imaginations hope, but we can pick some examples in different parts of the province where different aspects of those goals are really achieved very well, and other contexts in which there could be some improvement. But the model of Francophone schools outside Quebec, being community centers, is more and more being absorbed as a model that could be, well, first of all, it's got, through my decision, constitutional blessing. So just to actually take a step back and talk about the status of the English language not related to schools. So we're an official language minority in the English-speaking community in Quebec. An official language minority by federal definition. But we're not an official language minority in Quebec because there's only one official language in Quebec. But while there's only one official language in Quebec, top line definition, the English language has official status in many contexts, to the point where it is kind of a tautology, or it's a contradiction possibly, to kind of try to give it a name or a status that properly describes its rights. So we're in the Constitution. The use of English is guaranteed in the course of the legislature. We're in the Education Act. We're in the Constitution in regard to our educational rights and the rights to control and manage our institutions. We are in the Healthcare Act, so not constitutional guarantee for health rights, healthcare rights for the English-speaking community, but legislative guarantee. Imperfectly implemented through structures that currently exist, but nevertheless, it's a matter of principle that's there. We're in the preamble to Bill 101. The English language is acknowledged. So to say it's not an official language is to give only half of the case. And the awareness of the community of its, while the community is very diverse, while the community has a different character in different geographical regions, and it's got an evolving character, because even in the regions, if the demographic numbers are holding up, it's not because the children of the previous generation are staying there. We saw in Kate's statistics that there's a big outflow, but they are actually being replaced by itinerant Canadians or immigrants from elsewhere. And the English-speaking community is made up of people who speak English, not people who are of Scots-Irish descent, people who speak English by choice. And they can be speaking English by choice in any number of contexts. They could, without having any kind of internal process as regards what their cultural sort of association is, find themselves facing a doctor, wanting to convey a message, feeling that the way in which that message is best conveyed is a language that they're more comfortable in, and they ought to have a right to use that language in that context. They might want to go to an English film, they might want to go to an English play, they might want their kids to learn English for very instrumental reasons. For the, I think that there's going to be a better employment prospect for my kid if he gets out of university, she gets out of university with these tools, package of tools. One of them might be the English language. And that abstract decision in the hands of the parent or the child in that example is a civil right and doesn't derive from the collective rights of the community. Community doesn't own that individual. The individual decides to associate with the community. So it's vital that there be structures inside the community that allow for those kinds of points of connection. And the schools, because they're there everywhere, are an obvious, and they're not the only device, but the schools, because they're there everywhere, are an obvious point of connection. and building up an awareness in our school board structure and our school system of that role, which, as I said, is a model we could take from the very successful evolution of Francophone communities outside Quebec, is something that I think we've done a decent job at, but we have to do more and more kind of work to create that understanding. The school boards, of course, are not financed for this purpose. They are, to some extent, actually, probably Russell can deal with this better than me, but they're not penalized, they're controlled to the degree to which, or in regard to the degree to which they can do things beyond their formal educational mandate. And as a community, we can put up our hands and object to that, or argue for greater resources. And because there are federal transfer funds available to support those kinds of projects, those kind of additional responsibilities that schools might take on, school boards might take on, organizing as a community to deploy those funds, and I'll just take another little side bar here. In education, there are somewhere between $50 and $70 million of annual transfer dollars from Ottawa to Quebec for the education system. Well, the reason there are those two numbers is because there are two programs, one of which is for English-speaking community and one is for linguistic duality. So it can conceivably be deployed in a broader set of kind of contexts, including teaching English to Francophones in, say, the civil service. But $50 to $70 million is a big chunk of dough, and most of it disappears into nowhere in the education department. There's inadequate accountability and transparency, and certainly the community could become more active in advocating that the federal government, if it believes it's providing resources for us, actually ensures it's providing resources for us. And those resources could go into building up the schools as community centers, or one of the places that they can be spent. So that's an area in which I think probably all of our opinions are aligned, but as to whether or not our efforts are harnessed as effectively as they might be, obviously the federal government's got some issues with picking a fight with the government of Quebec over something that might be considered a kind of a marginal issue. But they also have some issues about spending money ineffectively. There are some tools to work with there. Anyway, I was making an argument for the schools being, they are, and continuing to be, and becoming more community-centered, community centers and oriented towards being structures of the community. I think this is, a model that really applies everywhere. It doesn't apply in exactly the same way in very remote rural communities where the school might be the only institution of the community that is, within driving distance. But it applies everywhere in some degree. So, in the densest part of English Montreal on the West Island, there may be other things, churches, municipal institutions, social networks, sports leagues or whatever, all sorts of other things that could be argued to be kind of part of the English-speaking community, and do you really need the school to help? But the school is likely still to be that great sort of central building with an auditorium and a whole bunch of other very useful assets that is right there and owned and operated by sympathetic institutions. So, from the most remote and underserved to the densest and most well supplied with assets, still the school is very important.
Introduce Russell Copeman. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Honors Political Science from McGill University. He was named Executive Director of the Quebec English School Board Association in September of 2018. Mr. Copeman is also a member of the teaching staff of McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. He's the former MNA of Notre Dame de Grâce. Active in the community, Mr. Copeman has been involved in and sat on boards of a number of community organizations. Russell.
Thank you, Richard. Bonjour, hi. I would like to start with a little bit of audience participation. And audience participation on a gross generalization. Alors, je vous demande, ceux de lever la main et maintenir dans l'air, ceux qui pensent que l'éducation, c'est l'affaire de tous? Would you raise your hands and keep them up if you believe that education is everyone's business? Okay, then look around the room. Okay, I'll get back to that later. Thank you very much. I want to talk a little, just briefly, about the Quebec English School Boards Association, alternately known as QESBA or QUESBA, if you listen to people. I'm going to read the mission statement of the organization. The purpose of the Quebec English School Boards Association is to advocate appropriate education for students in both the youth and adult sectors, and to enhance the effectiveness of school commissioners and member school boards in the area of education, finance, administration, and labor relations. So what does that mean? We provide some shared services, very little, but some shared services in the form of advice and counsel, particularly in the area of labor relations. And in fact, the QESBA, through another initialism, the CPNCA, le Comité Patronal de Négociation pour les Commissions Scolaires Anglophones, the CPNCA, negotiates all provincial non-monetary clauses in the collective agreements for the unions in the school boards. Very few people know that, and in fact, some commissioners don't know that. And, you know, that's a very significant responsibility and role for the QESBA. Especially the next round of collective agreements expire on the 30th of March 2020, and so 2019 is a very significant year. So one of the asides I throw out is, well, if school boards aren't there, who's going to do that? Service centers run by civil servants? 2,000 schools going to negotiate these things on their own? I'll just leave you with that thought. We represent school boards at the Ministère de l'Éducation et de l'Enseignement Supérieur, and its dizzying array of committees and subcommittees and work groups. Madame Langlois is here.
Hi there.
And so I talk about the dizzying array of acronyms and tables and work groups, all of which are very important. I don't mean to minimize them in the least, but they are quite dizzying. We represent school boards with community stakeholders and partners, and we do advocacy on behalf of our member boards. We have, of course, 9 member boards, and then an observer status with the Littoral, the Commission Scolaire Littoral. The 9 member boards have roughly 100,000 students in 340 schools and centers throughout Quebec. The budget of the QESBA is just under $1 million a year, financed largely through fees from member school boards. A small professional staff. About 65% or 70% of the budget of the QESBA is staff and fringe benefits. A very small, dedicated professional staff, and I can say that because I've only just joined them. I don't include myself in there just yet. And it's amazing with 6 people what the organization is capable of doing and producing. It is truly remarkable in my view. The QESBA has recently developed a strategic plan, which may alter that mission statement a little bit. But in the strategic plan, they talk about 3 Ds. We should help boards deliver and develop quality education and defend English public education. So you have 3 R's, so we have 3 Ds. Deliver, develop, and defend. Now, I love language. I love words. I do the New York Times crossword until about Thursday. And people who do the New York Times crossword know what I mean. I play Scrabble. I play Scrabble a lot with my wife, who's a writer and a published author. But I win. Not because my vocabulary is better. On the contrary, my wife's vocabulary is much better. But I play much more strategically. My wife, to get a good word, will open up the triple word score. Just because she's proud of the word that goes down, like acronym or whatever it is. And I won't do that. There's no way I'm going to open up a triple word score for another player for all the points on the board. The title of this workshop is Ensuring Community Vitality Through Education. So I approach this, let's look at each of those words. Ensuring. That's a significant challenge in and of itself. I'm not quite sure how one ensures various things. I can't ensure I'll be here tomorrow. We can't ensure much. So that in and of itself, it seems to me is a challenge. Community. Well, what do we understand by community? We've had this discussion for the last 3 days. Do we mean the English-speaking community? And by the way, it's very interesting, since I'm a former staff member of Alliance Quebec, and I was involved in the discussions, or not involved, as a staffer for 30 some odd years about whether we should use English-speaking or Anglophone. And yesterday one of the panelists said, I refuse to use the word Anglophone. It's English-speaking. Look up Anglophone. Just look it up. What does Anglophone mean? It means English-speaking. That's the definition of the word. Not to be confused with Anglo-Saxon. And I understand politically sometimes why we don't like to use the term Anglophone, because it means English-speaking people. It means people who chose English, to speak English, etc., from around the world. But, you know, it's a bit of a false argument. We say Francophones. We use that very commonly. I don't think we really mean people from France anymore. We mean French speakers. But anyway, I digress, as I'm want to do. So do we mean the community writ large? Do we mean local communities? Very different from place to place. President Lamoureux and I are just back from a trip to the Gaspé, visiting Eastern Shore School Board. The community of New Richmond does not resemble in any way, shape, or form NDG, nor New Carlisle, nor Chegouac-Bourdin, nor Bécombe, nor Sept-Îles. So, but those are local communities, and of course the essential role, and I'll talk about this briefly, is of schools in local communities. And then there's the word vitality. Well, now, in another workshop, the topic of another panel is defining and measuring community vitality. So I'm not going to try and define what vitality means. Apparently there's a gang over there trying to do that and understand it better. And I'm not a pedagogue, so I'm not going to try and define education. But enough nitpicking. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we have a common understanding of what all these terms mean and what we're supposed to talk about this morning. I want to talk very briefly about the Abbey report, the Advisory Board on English Education, which has just been published, come out. It's a remarkable document. It's very well done. And its title is Revisiting the 1992 Taskforce Report on English Education in Quebec. It's an update and revisiting of this report. It contains a tremendous amount of information. It, on first blush, certainly appears to be very rigorously documented. It's a great report. I encourage all of us to pick up a copy and to read it. I'd like to read from page 7 of that report, talking about this topic. A community's education of its young is one of the building blocks on which its future is founded. If it leaves the education of its young people to others, others will eventually define its cultural values and choose its social priorities. The Taskforce on English Education has approached its mandate from this perspective, a perspective it shares with the country's French-speaking minorities, and especially with Quebec's French-speaking majority. A public school system is a fundamental instrument in the forging of a cultural, social, and economic identity. By the way, those are not the words of this report. Those are the words of the 1992 report, better known by its name, the Chambers Report. Not this one. Someone much wiser. So, that sort of sets the stage for how important schools are. I think there's a consensus on the following issues. There is an English-speaking community writ large, however we want to define it. There are English-speaking communities across Quebec. Many are very small and quite precarious. Education is a key component in maintaining community and communities. I don't think I have to make that demonstration. People much wiser and more intelligent and better researched than I have make that point. And schools are a key component in education. That sort of goes without saying. It's not the only component, by the way. There's lifelong learning, there's remote learning, there's learning outside walls. I understand. But I think we would agree that schools are a key component in education. Schools need a critical mass of teachers, students, and administrators to function. So what are the ingredients for us to be vital, to thrive as a community? Well, we need quality education for our young people, that we prepare them to be able to live and work in Quebec. I believe that's true. That's adequate French language acquisition, respond to special needs, vocational education, adult education. Those are all key ingredients, in my view, for a vital community. What ingredients are we missing? Or do we need more of in our network to do that? Well, I think we need more students. I think most boards would agree that we need more students. The question of how to get more students is, of course, delicate in this province. There are potential sources. There are rights holders who send their children to French schools, pardon me. There are rights holders who send their children to private school, a phenomenon much more present in Montreal than it is anywhere else. Is there a single private English school outside the Greater Montreal area anymore? Couple. Stands. 2 or 3. Not a lot, but they're there. But the majority is, of course, in Greater Montreal. The other source is people who move here or arrive here. And it could include, of course, as the Abbey report recommends, and as the Chambers report recommended before it, and as the Jennings report recommended before it, a broadening of access to English language schools, which we dance around as a community with great elegance, but rarely tackle head on. So, more students, more teachers and professionals, and there are shortages and recruitment problems and challenges and retention problems that are not unique to the English network, by the way. That's happening right across Quebec and right across the country. So, but those represent serious challenges. We need a curricula better adapted to our needs and our students, and we heard some of that this morning with regard to the education program. We don't need just translation of programs. We need adaptation. And that's a challenge. And we need funding that meets the particular needs of our boards. We heard this morning Eastern Shore School Board with just about 1,000 students, covering Gaspé and the North Shore, territory the size of Belgium. Central Quebec School Board, represented here today by Jean Robert, who has a territory the size of Spain with 4,800 students. Spain! I've never been to Spain. I've been to Belgium. Belgium is relatively compact. You can get around. Spain is big.
Yeah.
The territory of the Central Quebec School Board is the size of Spain with 4,800 students. So despite these challenges, our schools are doing well. If you look at the Abbey report on page 19, and you look at 7-year graduation rates for public schools from 2014-15, English school boards are doing better at the 7-year graduation rate than the mean for their administrative region, every school board. I repeat, every school board, each of the 9 school boards, and Littoral, is doing better with the 7-year graduation rates than their administrative mean. Is everything perfect? No, of course everything is not perfect. That it would be ridiculous to argue that. Can we do better? Yes, with the right tools. Are there governance issues with school boards occasionally? Yes. Are there governance issues with other public bodies? Occasionally. Every now and again. So yes, we have some work to do, and we can do better. The elephant in whatever room I am in these days is, of course, the continued existence of locally democratically elected school boards. I happen to believe that school boards are a necessary and indeed vital element to our community. And for anybody who thinks that I say that because I've become the executive director of the QESBA, and that I want to protect my new job, which is occasionally what I hear, I believed that as a student 40-some-odd years ago. I believed it as a parent who had 3 children in English public schools. I believed it as a member of the National Assembly. I believed it as a borough mayor. And I believed it as a simple ratepayer. Long before, decades before I became executive director of the QESBA. I think there's a broad consensus that our control and management of our educational facilities is essential for us to survive and to thrive. That's certainly the experience of Francophones outside of Quebec. Schools are more than parents, at the risk of shocking some people in the room. Schools are more than parents, they're more than teachers, they're more than professionals, and they're more than administrators. In fact, one could argue that schools are the community. School boards with locally, democratically elected school commissioners provide a vital link between the community and our schools. So, if education is l'affaire de tous, as you seem to indicate early on in this discussion, with almost unanimous raising of hands, then the control and management of schools is also l'affaire de tous, including those members of our community who have no children in the system, who had no children or currently have no children, such as myself. My children are all graduated. I pay school taxes on 2 different territories because I'm very fortunate to own a summer residence, a modest summer residence in Saint-Agathe-des-Monts. My wife and I chose 10 years ago when we bought that property to pay our school taxes to the Sir Wilfrid Laurier School. That decision, by the way, cost us double than if we had paid it to the Commission Scolaire des Laurentides. Double. More than double until this year. But we felt it was important to support local English public education. And so we paid all those years. Now we're getting a break. Thank you very much. My school tax bill in Saint-Agathe went from $323 to $73. It'll still take me a few years to recoup the double I paid, but we're doing well. Thank you for your concern. So people without children in the system are ratepayers. We pay school taxes. And that's an important element, I think, in the discussion. That's, in my view, not surprisingly, maintaining public, locally elected school boards, democratically elected school boards, is one of the ways we will ensure our community's vitality. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, so it's time to open up the floor for questions. Yes.
One thing that neither of you mentioned, which I think is very fundamental to the Francophone schools outside Quebec, is identity building. Building as a member of the English-speaking community. Maybe Russell, just to say, is that something that is within, do you see that as part of the mandate of English school system? And I'd like to hear also Geoffrey's take on that.
Maybe President Lamoureux or Chairman Murray or Vice Chairman Robert would answer that. I can give you my personal opinion. I'm not sure what it's worth. These gentlemen have been in, they're school board chairman and vice chairman. I think yes, but the ultimate responsibility of school boards is, of course, and we've heard this also over the last 3 days. We need to graduate students. We need to teach students. Students need to learn. But the way the system is structured is, if they want to go on to higher education, not all of them do, but many do. If they want to graduate, if having a high school, what we used to call it, I don't even know if we call it a high school leaving certificate anymore, that's what we used to call it in my day, is important, either to get a job, to advance, etc., and you have to pass exams.
Yeah.
Passing those exams is, I would argue, until the system is changed, the fundamental role, well, it's the output to an education that's designed for students. But as I say, there are people in this room with much longer experience and much wiser than I could answer that, perhaps.
Maybe
Well,
Geoffrey.
yeah, I'd like to take this back to the first principles, right? The constitutional guarantee that gives us control and management of our schools has been subject of a good deal of litigation, and there's jurisprudence, and that jurisprudence includes the establishment of the principle that we have control over curriculum. So while we don't have control over curriculum, while absolutely everything in the province of Quebec is dictated by the Ministry of Education, that is not done based on their having the abstract authority to do so. It's being done based on the fact that they've taken that power. And as regards how we might address the question of pulling some of it back in, that's a very complicated, possibly politically sort of strategic question. But it goes to, are we going to take responsibility for the assuring that the experience that our kids have going through those institutions provides them with some sense of appartenance to our kind of collective entity. And, you know, the Francophones outside Quebec believe that very strongly, and consequently they've litigated on that subject, and consequently they've established some tools which we could use, but we don't use them. And as to regards how we could get from where we are now to a situation in which the school boards, or as a practical matter, either introducing into the curriculum or in some other ways, becoming a binding element in the community, is a matter for open dialogue. School boards have a terrible challenge they're currently facing. They've got to put their energy and organizational capacity into getting past that problem. We all have to help them with that. But in the course of this ventilation of the question of is a school board a good idea, we can argue for and maybe achieve better school boards. The model that you're going to have what's it called, a service center, and the Ministry of Education, and that there are 3,000 schools in the province of Quebec, right? 3,500 altogether. So a principal of one of those schools, even if it's a big and important school, a principal decides everybody else does this that way, but I'm going to do it this way because I think it's better for us. And he sells that to his community, and they're going to do some fundamental thing a different way. Somebody's going to arrive from the Ministry of Education and say, look, the idea that there will be independent, serious local authority, I think is preposterous. So, you know, we have this intermediary structure that is in a position to provide some of that support. So we are going to do this differently. We're going to do it differently in an organized way across a scale that can make some kind of sense, and there's a reason for the difference, and the difference could address the matter that you raise, Eva, where, you know, some dimension of connection with our cultural history or just the region, maybe it's not particularly language-based.
Eva, as I reflect on the question, the answer I would give is more definitive. Yes, or else, upon reflection, we might have been inclined to send our children to French public school. But we felt it was so important that our children go to English public school, for a host of reasons.
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, a comment. The notion of, say, the place of a school, right, in a community vitality situation. Just a little kind of, I guess, an advert for a recent federal decision, and we'll see if it's going to pass. But the official language and regulations around service to the public, communication to the public, this complicated methodology where you look at population percentage in the nature of the office, all of that. I'm really pleased to say that through some sort of really close collaboration between my former department in Canadian Heritage and the Treasurer Secretariat, it's now been added in the set of things that are going to be considered when one considers whether a federal office should offer services in the minority language. The presence of a minority language school. So it's not just population and numbers. The school is considered an indicator of community. That's the argument we made, and I'm really pleased to see that's in the regulation. So it's put it this way, from the federal level, that's very clear that the sentiment that minority communities have expressed about the crucial role that schools play in their vitality is now going to be recognized in federal regulation, which is a very good thing. The other one is more of a question because, you know, as we've heard these last couple of days, the offer of service and the situation of English language schools, it's certainly broadening. You know, the notion we talked about here about the idea of identity building and perpetuating a strong community into the future. But there's also, you know, access to health services through the school system. They're often seen as a place where services are provided. But I'm particularly interested because we hear so much about employability and challenges young people have. And even at the, you know, secondary, adult education, tech law level and so on. I'm curious to know whether the English language school system can do more in terms of bridging formal education into the workplace.
Okay.
We got some commissioners putting up their hands. So that-
Chairman.
Okay.
Well, just a couple of things, there's so many different components to this question, some of which are systematically ignored. One, in all of the school boards outside of, certainly the island of Montreal, a major proportion of the enrollment consists of French mother tongue students who speak French at home and who have rights to attend English schools through the father, grandfather, whatever clause. But when we begin to talk about acculturation and the school being a center of inculcation into the English language community, you risk alienating the very parents who are sending those francophone kids to English schools to learn about English, but are still reluctant to, if not afraid of, losing their Frenchness, their Quebecois identity. And so in the regions, the school boards walk that line between English, and we are rapidly evolving. This is another point, is that the evolution is very quick, rapidly evolving from English school boards to school boards whose schools teach in English. And that is a nuance that is extremely relevant. We have schools in Eastern Townships with in excess of 80, in one case in excess of 90% of the students who speak French at home. Parents come to the school who have difficulty speaking English, and all of our staff must be fluently bilingual simply in order to interact with the parents. If we are talking about the culture, identity building as Anglophones in a context like that, we are in fact going to alienate that part of our clientele completely, because they don't want to become Anglophones, but they do want their children to be equipped as bilingual. So the theme, or at least the motto of the English School Board in the Eastern Townships is moving ahead together in a bilingual environment, bilingual. And that is acceptable to Francophone parents, whereas acculturation, identity building would certainly not be. And I think that's a major consideration that may not apply in Montreal school boards or schools that have a very large and cohesive Anglophone population to serve.
I'm going back to your question or your comment that we need more students, and to me it's a question of supply and demand. If the part of the families who are sending their kids to French schools because they want their children to have a good grasp of the language, then maybe we need to work harder at building and strengthening the French language instruction within the English schools and providing opportunities for not only instruction and qualification, but socialization, which is another important aspect, not only within the English communities, but between the communities.
Pass it to the gentleman next.
I think actually Michael's point is quite well taken. I visit a number of schools throughout the province, and I see that phenomenon where you have schools that are filled with des ayants droit, but there's not a community around them. But, okay, so if we don't want to talk about maybe the role of school to promote identity, what do you think the role is of the school to promote community vitality then? I think that's bigger, it's different, but I do believe there is a moral imperative in the English school system to promote community vitality. It is a indicator of community vitality. If not, what's the incentive of people like me who, like you, don't have kids in the school system, have paid double the taxes for over 10 years until this year? What is our incentive to actually pay taxes to the English school board if the English school board doesn't give us anything?
The rights holders have rights. Their kids are going to those schools possibly for geographic reasons, but I think we'd be very interested to hear the point of view of an informed person from the francophone minority outside Quebec who faces the same kind of, it varies from place to place, but.
Yes, my name is Roderick Landry. I'm past director of the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities. And I came here to present. I'm retired now, but I find the debate quite interesting. I think what, sorry, I forget your name.
Mike Murray.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, but at the same time, you have to be careful about saying, well, we can't promote the English language because it's going to affect some. If they are right holders by being francophones, they're from exogamous couples, right?
Yes.
So our research, we did a lot of research on exogamy, and we find that the best way to respect both cultures, because exogamy is a microcosm of Canada, if you think about it. It's trying to save two languages in one family, as we're trying to save two languages in a single country. And so this, and what we find is if each parent speaks its own language to the children, and of course you have to make compromises when the whole family is together and all that, but then, but you also, if they attend a minority school, that's where the two identities are the most balanced. Because if you take the same francophone who chose the English school, I'm talking here mainly about those that resemble more the francophone minorities outside of Montreal. If they would go to the French school, they would probably lose completely their Anglophone identity. And it's the same thing for francophones going to an English school or even the immersion school, because some parents think the immersion school produces a better bilingualism, which is false, but anyway, they believe it and they base their choice on that. And the minority school will always give, if it's in a real minority situation, it always gives a better balance of the two languages and the two cultures. And our research has even been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada on that purpose, because I think they like the argument that a family, an exogamous family, is in a way a microcosm of the country.
Two quick observations. One, what Chairman Murray said is obviously true. However, I've learned very quickly in the last 8 weeks that even generalizations within a board are difficult. Eastern Shore School Board, the schools on the North Shore resemble more the types of situation that Mr. Murray talked about. That is to say, they're rights holders, but 2/3, 3/4 of those families are probably French speaking. In the Gaspé, at least the South Shore of the Gaspé, that's not the case. They are rights holders who are English-speaking people who, by the way, some of whom have significant resistance to even learning French, much to my surprise, I discovered. So this just highlights the challenges within the same board of a multiplicity of situations that have to be resolved, or that line that Mr. Murray talked about, walking is so fine, and frankly, it can be probably multiple lines within even the same school board. And by the way, I hadn't heard the word exogamous or exogamy pronounced until we went to, President Lamoureux and I went to a meeting of the Fédération Nationale des Conseils Scolaires Francophones. Exogamous families. Did you ever,
This new
It's not
job
you.
has been.
I'm telling you, I've just worked there. My Scrabble game has improved immensely in the last 7 weeks. It's quite amazing. And it's tough, you know, using the X is not easy in Scrabble.
I believe this, and then we have gentlemen over here.
I'm Dan Lammer, I'm president of the QESBA, and I'm chair of Riverside School Board, just on the South Shore. A couple of things I have noticed over the years is, and it was indicated by Kate and some of the other presenters, is the rapid decline in the English-speaking community vis-a-vis school, going to our schools. I think what's happened is that we're reacting or realizing this a long-term trend, and we're trying to correct it by involving the community, because we know that's a real serious point for our schools in making sure the community is vital. I think one of the things that when we went to Halifax last weekend for the Francophones was that it was the first time that we had reached out to that organization. And it was also an opportunity, and I think that we're going to be doing this more often, is because they have gone through this experience and we can learn so much from the Francophones across the country. And I think that and how they've worked through their issues and their problems is going to be an important point for us as we get to know and understand them more. So I think, you know, we've had a decline. We're going to try to stabilize it maybe in some areas. My board is moving gradually up, Michael's as well. And I think we need to incorporate the vitality of our community, because that's what's going to support our schools. And also, one last thing is the CLCs in my board are vital because they're all in our schools, but they support the vitality of those English communities throughout in my area in the South Shore. So to me, that's really important, and the two go hand in hand. The education of our students, as well as supporting the vitality through our schools and CLCs, and I just think they go hand in hand. I think David was the next one.
Exactly. Sorry.
Hi, I'm David Johnson, Commissioner of Official Languages, along with Charles Taker here. A couple of things. First of all, for those who may not know, outside of Quebec, other provincial governments have been looking at abolishing school boards as well. In PEI and Nova Scotia, they've abolished school boards for the English majority, but kept them for the French-speaking minority. So who knows? You know, we haven't seen the details yet of what the Legault government will propose. Things will probably emerge or change over the next year or so, so we should wait to see what comes out, and we can perhaps hope for this to be a outcome that will be seen as one that's constitutionally sound. Secondly, Michael mentioned the challenges of identity construction, so to speak, in a context where most of your students are Francophone. Understandable for sure. Not just a problem in Quebec, it's one it has to do with dealing with diversity outside of Quebec. In Ontario, we've seen in Penetanguishene, where there was a fight for French language schools and rights a generation ago. Now parents are starting to wonder whether or not there's too many English kids going into the French school, and what this will mean for language being spoken in the corridors, and there's a need for new approaches to protect the ability of the Francophone schools to transmit language and culture. So all across the country, the challenge of diversity is rubbing up against the challenge of identity construction, and that's an ongoing target or debate. Lastly, I'll just tell you a story about what happened at the Gazette, where I used to work up until 4 years ago. And in the past 10 years as an editorial writer. There was a point in the Gazette's history, like here now, where the Gazette had to decide what was its relationship with the political environment in which it operated, especially with the English-speaking community organizations. And a new publisher came in, Larry Smith, who said we have to stop describing ourselves as an Anglophone paper. We are a paper that publishes news in English for people who choose to read it in English. And it made a lot of sense because people were reading newspapers less. We wanted to capture more of the Francophone market. Francophone readers were 20% of our readership. The English community was declining. The result of that was a bit of a hesitancy to more attentively cover the politics of the community, the issues of the community, for fear that the Gazette would be identified as being angryphone. So rather than be labeled as that, the Gazette ignored it. And it went on for 10, 15 years, and the result today is that the Gazette does not have the same connection to the community, the same awareness of the community, and of its issues than it did before.
Just a quick comment on the abolition of school boards, very briefly. Of course, we need to see what legislation looks like. David, we're not going to wait and see. We're going to be active now to promote a vision of what we think the organization of English language education should look like. The real challenge will be, I've spoken to a number of government members. They understand, the Premier understands, that the English-speaking minority has charter rights. The battle is not to get the government to admit or understand that we have minority language education rights. The battle will be whether or not we believe their model, whatever that looks like, is charter compliant. And that's a big nuance. And we will have that discussion depending what the model looks like. All I can say to you is in the 3 jurisdictions where, outside of Quebec, where school boards were abolished, namely Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and the Yukon. The governments of the day that abolished those school boards began from the premise that they wished to be charter compliant. They announced to everyone that they wanted to be charter compliant, and the way in which they interpreted charter compliance was to retain French school boards. Not to transform them into something else, not to play around with the structure. They merely said, and we have this from multiple sources, in Nova Scotia, the Minister of Education walked in with, I think, 7 school board chairmen at a meeting and said, okay, you 6, legislation is being introduced this afternoon, you will be abolished, and pointed to the chairman of the Conseil Scolaire Acadien Provincial and said, you are maintained, as is, as a democratically elected local French school board. So it's the question of the degree of charter compliance that's going to be so essential. And the experience in other jurisdictions is those provincial governments and territorial governments just didn't touch the minority language boards at all.
In fact, they're enforcing some of the provisions with Nova Scotia francophones.
Just wanted to pick up on a comment that Dan made, and the exchange between QUESBA, an acronym, and FNCSF is a very good one to promote. I'll just mention though that about 10, 12 years ago, for 5 or 6 years, at Canadian Heritage, Rodrigue was representing the university community. We had David Birnbaum from QUESBA and Roger Paul from FNCSF and a few others in that milieu. And we had what we called the Research Roundtable on Minority Language Education. So bringing together English speakers from Quebec with Francophones from across Canada, including representatives of the Council of Ministries of Education of Canada and the individual ministries of education. And I would really suggest that that's something we should explore about reinvigorating, because a lot of the exchange that we've seen that's been very useful this last couple of days is looking at the examples and experience of people outside Quebec, what we can draw and learn from them. But frankly, at the time that Research Roundtable was quite active, the Community Learning Centre initiative was really taking root here in Quebec. And Francophones outside of Quebec were fascinated by it. They really wanted to understand it. We had a previous model called the Centre Scolaire Communautaire outside Quebec But that was not nearly as widespread in practice or even as an approach as what we've seen with CLCs. That was like a huge bricks and mortar, millions of dollars for each installation, and there's only 25 or 30 of them across the country. But the notion of having a way of gathering resources to make schools, or to give schools the opportunity to work more closely with communities as a way of improving educational outcomes and improving community vitality, that I think is an idea really worth exploring. And I would say too, further in that regard, even my own department, the Ministère du Conseil Exécutif, there's a lot of interest in fostering connection and communication between the English-speaking minority in Quebec and Francophones outside of Quebec, in education, in health, in culture, in other areas. So I think that's certainly something that we'll look towards promoting, and those who want to work on those kinds of things will be happy to work with you.
Does that mean you're willing to spend money on that?
I believe so. Make me an offer.
Sorry.
Trying to keep track of all the speakers.
Thanks, Richard. John Buck, I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of SEDEC. I have a question with a bit of a trajectory. We'll respond to a question that Phil proposed earlier, and then perhaps go to Mr. Copeman with respect to the meat of the question. As I look at ensuring the vitality of the English-speaking community through education, as kind of the premise of this discussion today, I think we all, and I don't want to be too provocative in a gentle way when I say this, I think we all can acknowledge that education has an important contribution to make to the vitality of the community, that it is not something that is done uniquely through education. There are a variety of sectors that have a role to play in terms of the overall vitality, and again, absolutely respect and appreciate the tremendous contribution that education makes, and we've seen evidence of that throughout the course of this conference, speaking about the success of our education industry. We work in the space of economic development and employability, so that's kind of my take as I look to the contribution that we can make to the vitality of the English-speaking community. And I'll pick up on an example just to respond to a question that Bill posed earlier about employability and connection with the education system. And perhaps this will touch on something of great interest to Mr. Murray that I think he's aware of. We're involved currently in the Eastern Townships in a pilot project where we're introducing employers to the technical vocational space of the Eastern Township School Board, along with the colleges and CEGEPs in the area, to talk about how can we collaborate more effectively. There's a tremendous respect and appreciation for what the education community has the capacity to do, as well as the recognition that sometimes our efforts aren't always well aligned with what the business community needs on the outside. And this has been tremendously enlightening for the business community. It's been wonderful for some of the businesses, and we're looking at ways to optimize that relationship. So that's just an example, Bill. That's included inviting, of course, folks from the education community to participate in chambers of commerce and doing things like this that I think is terrific. The question to Mr. Copeman, ultimately, is this is an example of an effort that's being made where we're trying to, I think, leverage that contribution that the education community makes to vitality in a specific area with a specific set of characters. Are there ways that other sectors can leverage more effectively the education world, those folks that are part of QUESBA, for example, and all the school boards, to really optimize the contribution that the education community is making to vitality along with those other sectors? Are there ways? Are there ways that we can do that more effectively and that we can enable that contribution to happen more seamlessly than it's already happening?
I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, except that, you know, I think part of the approach is a local one, right? I think the school boards are best placed to do that. Many of them are doing it. There's no doubt about it. And, you know, I said in my remarks that, of course, education is not the only component, or a school is not the only component to community vitality. May have been a slip of the tongue, and I mean no disrespect, but both Mr. Chambers, both Jeff and I looked at each other when you used the term the education industry. I tend to view it as a public good, not as an industry, but
It can be both.
it can be both, absolutely. So yeah, I'm sure there are ways. I think they need to be explored more locally than through the QESBA.
Okay, A very small anecdote and then a question for Geoffrey. In 1986, I was invited in Alberta to talk about the role of Francophone schools. They didn't have too many at the time, because the charter was 1982. So, and I gave 22 conferences. On my last one, I was dead tired. One lady stands up and says, "Sir, you're separating our communities with your theories and so on, because no, we feel we're in the same school, Anglophones and Francophones, and you want to separate the community." And so I didn't know how to respond to such a thing. Didn't want to start all over. So I just asked her. I said, "Is your mother still alive?" She said, "Yes." "And do you feel separated from your mother?" She says, "No, I love her, and I visit her very often, and so on." I said, "That's the difference between separation and autonomy." So this brings me to, I think I heard Geoffrey talk about her at the beginning of his talk, that you see yourselves as having a right to manage your own institutions. Okay. Well, there's a concept called cultural autonomy. I don't know if you know about it. It's a concept that's been used right after First World War, and it's largely used in Europe, Eastern Europe. But there's also a sociolinguistic aspect to cultural autonomy, and the late Joshua Fishman makes a difference between political autonomy and cultural autonomy. So if you don't want to separate from the state or your province or whatever, but you just want a cultural autonomy, in the same way that an adult can be autonomous and not necessarily separate from the rest of the institution and so on. So it's, but I was surprised by the fact that you said that you have a right. I thought in the charter, I thought there was only New Brunswick, which has a clear collective right to manage their institutions at Article 16.1. But I don't know, I've never seen that. It might be in the first constitution, or so. I'm not a lawyer. I would like to maybe you to extend that right, to elaborate more about that right, and maybe and say if a concept like cultural autonomy could meet your needs.
Yeah, well, I think that we're not in the body of the Constitution initially, so it's something that's built up in jurisprudence, but largely than my decision.
Yeah, but that's school. The school's not institutions.
Right, as to whether or not that guarantees control and management, we would argue that control and management can't be realized through a school. It doesn't have it. And I think that other people have argued that, and whether or not that was the determining persuasive argument that caused the Supreme Court ultimately to come down that side, that's a tricky question when it comes down to what David and Russell have been playing with it, that it's possible that a provincial government trying to navigate through what is arguably our rights, giving this analytical task to a unsympathetic but clever legal team, could come up with something that they could argue was sufficient. I think with the alliance that I think we'll be able to develop with Francophones outside Quebec, who will be horrified by the idea that this is being done to us, and with the basic legal tools available to us, we have a better chance of winning some, imaginary future litigation. And if we have a better chance of winning, a sufficiently better chance of winning, maybe we can avoid having to do it. But I would actually come to your cultural identity question. It seems to me that English Quebec, although it is very broad and different from community to community, and it's region to region, there are a few kind of umbrella qualities. And one of the umbrella qualities of English Quebec is its connection with French Quebec. People live in Quebec now because, sometime between 1976 and today, they or their parents didn't leave, and they're all, everybody will be aware of kind of connections of one sort or another. Even recent immigrants will have, well, I came to Quebec, but my cousins went to Toronto. there's a decision involved in living here, which expresses a connection with the collectivity, and we haven't actually worked out how to make that expression kind of clearly appreciated and understood by the majority community, enhance our acceptance. But I think that it's a project that we can undertake, which will both be reinforcing to our own identity and address some of the questions that Mike has very validly raised as regards to confusion in respect of language. Allegiance questions that arise from it could help with that and help with our acceptance of the majority community, and really, kind of work towards one of the things about the English school system is it would be nice, and we're getting closer to this, but it would be nice if the language skills of a graduate of an English high school were indistinguishable from the language skills of somebody graduated from a French high school. And I mean language skills, so, if you look at what they might have as achieved goals in, say, the Netherlands or Iceland, where people don't graduate from high school without having 2 languages, 2 really workable, employable languages, maybe even a whole language, but we can get there, and it would be an asset for everybody in Quebec to have that, and we're not going to get there tomorrow, but we can lead the way. I'm sorry, I probably that's great.
Yeah, it is our firm belief at the QESBA that the control and management provisions as developed in jurisprudence through Article 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms are in the hands not solely of parents, that they are in the hands of the community. The Constitution doesn't say so, it's jurisprudential, it's a Supreme Court judgment, other levels of court judgments. It's been supported by various legal research we've done. But, and that is our position, is that the right to control and manage our, as a minority community, a linguistic minority community, our educational facilities is in the hands of the community and not just parents. We recognize there are other interpretations. And my suspicion is the Department of Justice has probably convinced previous governments and potentially this current government that they would be charter compliant if the control and management was in some way exercised by parents, because that's what we keep hearing from government members, that it's parents who will be able to help control and manage, therefore we're charter compliant. That is not our position. We believe that those charter rights have to be interpreted very broadly. We believe there's sufficient grounds for that. When I was an member of the executive committee of the City of Montreal, our lawyers told us on about 6 occasions that the case we were about to hear was ironclad, solid. And then we lost 4 out of 6 of them. So I know what lawyers can argue. I'm not a lawyer myself. 4 lawyers, 6 opinions, all of which they're convinced are right.
Okay, we're over time. We have a couple more quick questions.
Jean Robert, I'm from Central Quebec, from Quebec City. A little in response to what Mike said, I worry the day that we believe the only thing we do in our English schools is teach in English. To me, that's the end of our schools. And I think we had a slide that Kate showed earlier. Some of the things we do that are different. And the day we not only forget those things, again, I think people do not choose, parents do not choose to send their kids to our schools only because they're English. They choose it because there's a pride in our schools. Kids wear jackets that you don't see in the French schools. Next week, in the next few weeks, I see poppies. I can assure you that our English schools will all respect that day. I can assure you very few French schools will. That's the difference. We don't have to throw it in people's faces, the Francophones, but we do act differently. So again, it worries me when I say, well, we have to accept that we're just teaching in English. We're doing a lot more than that. I see it at graduation, at Quebec High School, when I see a graduating class with a young handicapped child that would have never gotten through our system, but was in class with the same students from grade 1. So when he graduates, with special needs, people are excited. Parents are excited. They say, look at that.
that's a special school. So I just have to remind that if we're opening a new school at our school board in Levis, wonderful, Levis, beautiful new community for us. Well, they will not only be sending their students to an English school, they'll be sending them to a school that has a basic philosophy that may stem from English education.
One last question here.
Hello, my name is Ken Lumber. I work at the Community Learning Centers. I'm very pleased that the name has come up a few times. I think a key for that is just around the partnerships and an openness towards developing school-community partnerships, which contributes to vitality. My actual question, though, is, so I live in Myland Plateau of Montreal, and I guess I want to appeal to the community to be flexible, to also go where the community is. Living in this area, there's just a mass of people who've come from other provinces living in this very small area. There's no English schools, there's no, as far as I can tell, institutional aspects of the English-speaking community kind of reach out and bring these people in. So I guess I want to raise awareness around that, is that I have friends who send their kids to French schools because the culture of the Plateau Island is to walk, no one has a car. And there's been no move to kind of move schools that are empty to this area. I realize it's expensive, but this is what I appeal to. Let's go where the community is and not just where it historically has been.
It's pretty tough to move a school.
But there's buildings.
I understand, but
Okay, closing remark. ILIT has plans to write up a report of many of the conclusions, best practices, and so forth from this conference, and I wish them luck trying to summarize what they said today. So once again, I would like to thank very, very much Russell and Geoffrey for a very provocative and interesting discussion. And I encourage you to continue this as we move through the day. Thank you very much.